Welcome to the Integrated Schools Podcast. I'm Andrew, a white dad from Denver.
And I'm Courtney, a white mom from LA.
Episode 14, Kirkland on Integration. We're joined today by Dr. David Kirkland, the Executive Director of the NYU Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. Dr. Kirkland is an educational equity scholar, activist, educator, cultural critic, and author.
And Dr. Kirkland is brilliant.
Yeah.
And he gives us so many ways to think. It's clear that he has been thinking about these issues for a really long time.
Yeah, I would say this one felt a bit like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Yeah.
Just keeping up with all of the brilliant people who have influenced him, who he can quote from memory, was a little bit overwhelming.
Yeah. But if you listeners, if you want to check out the show notes for this episode, you'll see links to many of the scholars and citations that he references.
Yeah. So this is a long one. I think it's a really important one.
Yeah.
We both listened to this a bunch of times to process it all. And
At least a bunch.
Yes. Yeah. I'm excited to get it out there into the world to share it with you. So I will say I am a little disappointed in the sound quality for Dr. Kirkland.
Yeah.
We had some technical difficulties. We had to use a phone line, and I think the content more than makes up for it, but there are definitely some bits that are a little bit hard to understand.
Yeah. At one point, he references Gloria Ladson Billings, who is the former president of the American Educational Research Association. So be, on the listen for that. And our apologies if it takes a little bit more work on your end to get what Dr. Kirkland is saying. But yeah, it's worth it.
Deli, the only other thing to highlight before we jump in, Dr. Kirkland mentions a couple times de facto versus de jure segregation, and yeah. I'm sure most people know what that is. I wanted to go back and refresh my own memory. So just in case, de jure segregation is sort of intentional policies, laws that create segregation, and de facto segregation is segregation that just has to do with sort of the way things are, right? Like we live in segregated neighborhoods, and so we have segregation. It's natural or something like that. So.
Yeah, exactly. So let's go to the episode. Dr. Kirkland, can you tell us a little bit about being part of the new Resource Center for School Diversity and Integration in New York City?
I'm part of an amazing crew of individuals who have come together to be on the external advisory group to New York City schools, and that is the School Diversity Advisory Group. Last week we released our first stages of recommendations, as well as some definitions and some description of our process for integrating New York City schools. As many people know, New York City has schools that are among the most segregated in the nation. And we've asked questions since Brown, and some of us even before that, how might we come together? What's holding us back? And I think now we're beginning to return to those conversations. They're going to be difficult. They will require courage, but I do think that we can begin to resolve some of those conversations through some collective efforts.
I mean, New York is kind of paving the way in a lot of ways for doing a community-wide push for school integration. And I think it started quite a bit, or at least was grounded in some serious activism and grassroots activism.
So when New York City announced its diversity plan, and the diversity plan was part of its, educational equity initiative, it was announced June 6th, 2017. When it announced that plan, I was one of the few voices who came out for it. There has been a kind of retreat or recession of critical educators around the question of integration because they believe that integration is a bogus bargain. The argument here is that if we send Black and brown kids to school with white people, that the sending of our kids to school with white people is some kind of antidote, is some type of intervention, right? And so many critics believe that understanding of integration is fundamentally racist, which it is, right? The idea that, in order to get a good education for your kids, they must have some proximity to whiteness, as if whiteness has some magic to it, right? That can begin to challenge histories of inequity and social violence that is embedded in structures. And so many critics of integration have seen it as a bogus bargain that's tied to a larger project of white supremacy. Yeah. I see it differently. And the reason I see it differently is because I define integration differently. I define integration not as a theoretical question, but as an empirical question. The most diverse schools in New York City have achievement differences, graduation differences, discipline differences that are, much smaller than the differences that you see in our most segregated schools. When you look at the most segregated schools here in New York City, what you begin to see are those disparities growing, right? The biggest disparities in graduation, for instance, are among, more economically advantaged and less economically advantaged individuals. And so wherever you have a concentration of poverty or a concentration of vulnerability juxtaposed against a concentration of privilege, you see the largest disparities, the largest gaps in graduation, in achievement, in discipline, in attendance. And so here, when we look at the empirical question of education, where we see educational inequity stand up is in the place of segregation. And when we see segregation in New York City, we got two types of segregated schools. We got segregated schools that serve concentrated, vulnerable students, and we got segregated schools that serve a high majority of concentrated, privileged students. And it's something about that dynamic that creates not what I call achievement gaps or opportunity gaps, right? I think that gap metaphor is wrong. It creates barriers, opportunity barriers, or what I've called opportunity monopolies, where individuals get to hoard not only opportunity, but they also get to deny others from essential opportunities within education. And that is the fundamental definition of segregation. The opposite of segregation is not integration. The opposite of segregation is access to those opportunities. And therefore, when we begin to look at this arrangement between vulnerability and privilege that articulates a segregated system, white supremacy, as well as anti-Black and brown racism that kind of drive the system of segregation, we know that at the root of both integration and segregation are power. And for integration, if we're going to redefine integration, it simply means our ability to come together, to share power collectively in order to make decisions and create the conditions for the best possible education that we can have for all of our young people.
Pushing back against the opportunity or achievement gap metaphor is really, really important. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I haven't been okay with the achievement gap metaphor for years. And Gloria Ladson-Billings is a renowned educational scholar responsible for giving us culturally relevant pedagogy, which later becomes culturally responsive education, Geneva Gaysworth, or culturally sustaining education. She also brought to education, critical race theory. When Gloria Ladson-Billings was president of the American Educational Research Association, ARA, in her address, her presidential address, she begins to talk about the education debt. And her argument was that the achievement gap suggests that there is something wrong with people who just cannot make ground. Those young people are left behind, that there is, a deficiency or a deficit in some kids. And so what she begins to move toward is not, blaming the kids, for educational outcomes, right? So instead of talking about failing students, she asks the question, how are we failing students? And when the notion of failure moves from the kids to the system, then we have a different construct. We don't have a gap. Now we have what she calls a debt, that we are actually paying some students what we owe them through our public education system, right? We're guaranteeing them, opportunities through education, and there are other kids that we're not paying. And so within that idea, right, this movement away from the gap metaphor, gives us something else. It gives us a new language to begin to talk about, responsibility. It gives us a new language to talk about accountability. It gives us a new language, to talk about, what we actually owe, our obligations to our young people. To me, that was important, but it didn't go far enough in some ways, right? Because in some ways, the idea of debt that we're paying some kids, we're not paying other kids, they talk about the hoarding of opportunity that happens within the educational system. The very visible hoarding of opportunity that happens within our society, that some people not only have access to opportunity, some people, they kind of keep this opportunity. They kind of cling to that opportunity. They kind of hold on to that opportunity. And we need to understand that, right? So what happens is you don't have an achievement gap or an opportunity gap, right? Because the gap metaphor is insufficient in explaining the ways that we have privileged some and disadvantaged others, right? What we have are barriers that are constructed between vulnerable individuals and privileged individuals, and that those barriers are being kept up, and as those barriers are being kept up because of policies within the system and because of other arrangements that we have made within the educational system, opportunity gets displaced from one side of that barrier, and it gets kept exclusively on the other side of that barrier. And so what I see is a barrier as opposed to a gap. What I see are obstructions to some individuals gaining access to opportunity and access to privilege. And what I see is other, groups of students having, in some ways, a monopoly on that privilege, right? And so when I begin to talk about opportunity barriers, opportunity boards, it leads to another conversation around these economies, of opportunity. Opportunity monopolies where certain individuals, they get pretty much all the opportunities, whereas other individuals get relatively few, if any.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, at integrated schools, we talk a lot about the difference between integration and desegregation. And what we as an organization, at least, are hoping to sort of be part of is moving the needle on integration, not just the reassigning of kids to different schools. Because, I think we see it across the country that even if you can move the needle on desegregation, you often end up just then resegregating kids as soon as they get into the building, whether that's, gifted and talented or dual language.
That's right. And segregation takes a lot of different forms now. When we begin to think about what segregation is, the logics of segregation, the ways that systems of exclusion, systems of separation, are seen as educational policy, special education, the idea of restricted environments, non-restricted, least restricted, restricted environments, and special education gives us another segregationist policy within the educational complex that adversely affects, students of color. So we know that, young men of color, Black and Latinx young men are in places like California, some Southeast Asian young men are more likely to be placed in special education than their white counterparts. And at some rates, it's like 6 to 8 times more likely. And we know that they're more likely to be placed into restricted, environments. When we look at gifted and talented programs, we know that those programs are more likely to serve people who have come from some economic advantage. And so here we have strictly within educational policy, but not de facto segregation, but de jure segregation, segregation by policy that breaks down that socioeconomic status as well as race. So we have a special education policy that creates segregation by concentrating vulnerability, and we have a gifted, sets of policies that concentrate privilege, in a sense, creating the same type of thing that we see based on, whole school segregation.
And so do you think that sort of fundamentally the benefit of fighting for integration is that white privilege sits on top of our entire society. And so the ability to get opportunity tends to follow white kids. Like, I guess maybe the other way is like, why not just try to push back against the opportunity hoarding and provide more opportunities in segregated spaces? Like, why take the next step towards integration?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question. One thing that I will say in terms of that question, I don't want to say that opportunity follow white kids. What I want to say is that we have designed a social system, an educational system, an educational market, that provide white kids not only with more opportunities, but with the ability to, kind of like hoard those opportunities through systems of segregation, to the effect of constructing opportunity monopolies. And then we create all other types of opportunities based on that opportunity hoarding, right? So if you have access to AP courses, or if you have access to algebra, or if you have access to these other things, you also gain access to college. You also gain access to, other opportunities within that system. And if you don't have those opportunities from day one, you lack access. From pre-K all the way through college. And it becomes like this reinforcing system of a chain of opportunity processes, right? And so I'm going to say that, kind of like organically just have access to, these opportunities, that these things follow them. What I would say is that we have a system that has constructed itself through a system of segregation, has constructed itself whereby some groups get opportunities and other groups don't.
Right.
And that's the system that we want to break. Right. The system that we want to break is a system that, does not see all of our kids evenly, and certainly does not treat them equitably. Mm-hmm. The system that we want to break is a system where power is hoarded, where power is not shared. Right. The New York City Department of Education's definition of integration, or new definition of integration that's inspired by a racial justice framework, is that integration is universal access to educational environments such as schools and classrooms where power is shared by all people, right? The idea here is to bring people together through the expansion and fair distribution of resources, opportunities, and freedom. To me, that's powerful, because right now we don't have a fair or even distribution or the sharing of power that brings people together through the expansion of fair distribution of resources, opportunities, and freedoms. So integration from a racial justice framework is saying, hey, give me not only my 40 acres and you, but also allow me to participate in the representative democracy. Allow me to participate in the sharing of resources as they, get distributed in order to promote, education. Allow me to participate in what counts as knowledge, what counts as curriculum, what counts as the language of instruction, what counts as standard or non-standard. Allow me to participate in the fundamental design of education. Don't just allow me to participate in the education system that you have designed that so recognizes, your cultural values, your social values, that gives you more resources and more freedom within that system. And so what we're arguing for in terms of integration is far different, than what had been argued for in terms of integration.
So I want to kind of keep on the subject of language and in how we're thinking about this. And one of the things that you talk about really powerfully to me is the broken schools narrative or crisis narratives around urban schools.
Well, I think there are a few things. Before I talk about crisis narratives, I do want to pick up this thing called broken schools, because to my mind, the schools aren't broken. Perhaps the system is, but the schools are working as they, have been designed to work, right? They have been working based on a system that seeks to privilege some individuals. And here we have to move the conversation beyond white privilege. I think that privileges are important for everyone to have. What we call white privilege, being able to go to school and feel safe. Everyone should enjoy that. I don't want to take that away from white students or more economically advantaged students. In fact, I believe that every child should be able to go to school and experience safety, should be able to experience love, should be able to, expand themselves by being exposed to, a variety of cultures, should also have an opportunity to love the culture and the skin and the language that they exist in, that all of these things should happen together. And it shouldn't be just one group who gets to enjoy those things. So the privilege conversation, I want to move beyond it, because I think that privileges within a system of education aren't necessarily the culprit. Privileges are things that we should give all of our kids. Lewis Gordon, the philosopher, begins to distinguish between what he calls privilege and license. And he says that, white privilege are things that pretty much we think that everyone should enjoy. Everyone should enjoy, certain privileges, the privilege of safety, food, comforts. He says that some people have luxury. An idea of luxury is that, there's an extravagance that comes in addition to their privilege. And he goes on to argue that luxury isn't even the problem, right? He argues that the problem is license, that there's this thing called white license, the idea, the fundamental framework, the ideology that suggests that not only are you privileged, not only do you have luxuries that go beyond your privileges, but you also feel entitled within that system, that you have license to that system. You have a license to say what is valued and a license to say what is not. You have a license to articulate how resources get used. You got a license to construct the language and the definitions of success and failure. You have a license to disregard. Michelle Alexander, in her book, New Jim Crow, calls this disregarding a new form of, racism. She calls it indifference, right? A more potent form of racism, like the idea that we don't have to care, and we certainly don't have to care enough to humanize individuals, within a system, right? And so back to that conversation about broken schools. The reason why I say you don't have broken schools and what the crisis of schooling is that we have resigned somebody to the status of, nobody, as Marco Mathieu said. We've assigned some students to the status of being expendable. Like if we had the crisis in education that we have with, Latinx students or Black students or Southeast Asian students, in places like Minnesota and Los Angeles, if we had the type of educational crisis that's happening among those students with white students, we wouldn't be indifferent. The president of the United States might call a state of emergency and release extra funding to pour into our schools. Instead of building walls, he might begin to, build bridges and curriculum. Right? We know that when this happened before, right, in our country, when Russia launched the satellite into space, we just released billions of dollars into, our educational system. Because we saw that there was a crisis in education, and we summoned the courage in order to educate our best and our brightest, and which meant all of our kids in ways that would expand the possibilities of our democracy. But we put a label on it. We put the label that it was for white only. And that's fundamentally the problem. That the crisis in education right now is that we have so engineered or allowed for a system. And this is what segregation, and integration is about. We have so allowed for a system within our multicultural, pluralistic democracy that suggests that the system should only serve particular individuals, depending upon the gender they are, the color of their skin, the faith that they espouse, the socioeconomic background of their parents, particularly their father. Right? We've constructed a system that says we will serve you based on arbitrary, capricious indicators. And if you don't fall in the right place, the system is not only not designed to serve you, that the system and those who are in control of the levers of the system don't care. I agree with the Supreme Court in 1954 that separate is inherently unequal. And that if we're going to move to progress, if we're going to move to valuing, if we're going to, take the crisis of education as we understand it now, which is a crisis that looks back in history at us, a history that says that we can value some, but we certainly do not value all equally or evenly. If we look at that crisis squarely, we have to admit that we haven't done much to resolve it. And what we have done to resolve it certainly hasn't moved our young people in directions where we see an education system that actually protects, supports, values, sustains, and advances them in the ways that it has its more elite students.
I'm thinking a lot about how, parents in different parts of the country are talking about, I'd love to send my kid to such and such global majority school or urban school. But, the school systems are just so broken. Like, I just can't do it. It's just broken. And so it prevents a stepping in, right? Because there's a sense of personal sacrifice, like you're sacrificing your kid. And so the ways in which we talk about broken schools, and I agree with you, right? Like the schools are functioning exactly as intended. How do we transform that conversation so that those spaces are spaces that white and or privileged parents can embrace in a much different way?
Well, I want to answer that question in two ways. I think that we've become fond of giving ourselves reasons why not to act.
Yeah.
I think we've become fond of, saying that, well, we can't do what's necessary in order to create a better world because this is the way the world is. Without the understanding that the world is constructed. The world is created. We made the world the way that it is, which means we can remake it in another way. The broken schools that, white parents fear sending their kids to will not change unless we go in and change them. And guess who got the resources? And guess who has, the political capital, according to all social science research that I've read, many of them. And part of that is the problem, is that when they do go in, they go in with, not an agenda of the community, not building with and in solidarity with, the individuals who have existed there, understanding those experiences. They go in there with their own individualistic agenda, and it creates tension. Mm-hmm. And not only does it create tension, it creates, levels of resentment that's tied to a more lingering, racial history, racial past. And I think the true conversation, those parents are having is, what can I get for my kids and what can I get now for them without having to do, all the work that it's going to require to engineer and make a better world for all kids. Mm. Yeah. And I think that is fundamentally the problem. That we can actually make better schools if we decide to make better schools, to come together, to have some type of collective participatory enterprise that is not based on gentrification, but is based on something else that is, about bringing people together to share power, not about occupation, not about invasion, but about brotherhood and sisterhood and being the best neighbors to, our fellow citizens in order to create an educational set of conditions that will benefit everybody. And I do believe when some parents begin to make that decision, not only will they help to create better education systems for their kids, they'll be responsible for making better education systems for all kids. Their efforts will become the model by which we will frame our future. Because we have to, if this country is to endure, we have to resolve this question. We have to resolve the question about how we collectively can create a society, that does not just benefit the few, but benefit all. Right. And I do think that is a question. It's a big question, but it is not an insurmountable question. It's a question that we can collectively grapple with. It is a question that we can collectively address. And I do believe that those parents who decide to join in the project of power sharing, join in the project of bringing people together around collective empowerment, in order to rethink how we do schooling in this country, I do believe that those parents will gain benefits for their kids that they cannot even imagine. Mm-hmm. A society, where poverty begins to diminish. Like Martin Luther King said, a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I do believe that the promise of hope anywhere becomes the promise of hope everywhere. That when we create a society where the conditions are where we, begin to erase the fine lines of poverty, the lines of disparity, where everyone can seek and live out, the American dream, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, where no one is on the margins, none of us have to be frightened that we will be marginal. Mm. And everyone benefits in that conversation. Everyone benefits in that dynamic. That's why those parents should do it. And not just those parents, that's why all parents and all community members and even people who don't have kids but are part of our society, that's why we should all join in this process, because it is one of the most important processes that's tied to the American project. The other thing that I want to say to that question is that so much of the conversation on integration has privileged white parents to the detriment of all the work that parents of color have done in order to bring together a country. Right. When I talk about power, I usually talk about power with prepositions. There's power over, like the type of oppressive power that you see with gentrification. Gentrification is not integration. Gentrification is a type of occupation that imposes the sense of power over the people who already exist there. And sometimes it forces those people out of their space. There's also collective power, power with others, right? Empowerment. And then there's power within, this type of internal power. And these two types of power to me are important, right? Because they have forged something. They have forged opportunity. They have forged potential. They have forged hope. And the thing is, this is the type of power that people of color have galvanized around in order to survive. In order to survive under conditions where they have not been recognized or valued. That they have been fighting the fight for integration, even when white parents weren't interested in fighting the fight for integration. So when we start the conversation with how can we get white parents involved, we in some ways erase all of the work that those Black mothers and their children, little girls like Ruby Bridges or the Little Rock Nine did, the assaults that they took, both the microaggressive and macroaggressive assaults. Imagine what it was like to have to be walked to school with somebody with a machine gun strapped to their hip in order for you to get their safety. Imagine, going and sitting in a classroom where all the students don't like you and the parents of those students don't like you, and even the teacher who stands before you looks at you with pity and disgust. Imagine what that was like. Imagine what those parents who sent their kids, who love their kids, went through in order for that to happen. Imagine everything that they have done. And when we start the conversation with white parents, we play into this larger narrative of white supremacy at the detriment of everything that parents of color have done, the sacrifices of their children, the sacrifices of themselves in order to push this country forward. So, and answer your question in two ways. White parents should do it because it's the right thing to do, and we all should do it because, integration and fighting for integration, bringing people together to share power in order to make decisions and to participate in the world that we want to believe in, the world that we want to see. We all should do that. But the second part, to start with them, is fundamentally problematic. We have to recognize first, and we have to recognize also that a lot of work has been done by communities of color, by people of color, by parents of color, children of color, that needs to be recognized. It needs to be held up in the same way that we seek to cater to white parents. It needs to be celebrated, and it needs to be, valued, validated, affirmed, respected, and put in the front of the conversation always.
I wonder a little bit about the root of the problem. On some level, there's like a racism root of a lot of the problems, but it seems like the only way we get to a place where we accept that some schools are performing the way they are seems like we have to think differently about certain populations of kids. We have to not have the same expectations for those kids. We not believe that some kids can achieve what all kids can achieve.
I think you're right. But I want to go back with the notion of racism being at the bottom or being at the base. I've come to believe that, racism is real. Racism is certainly driving many of the figures that we see in society. But I don't think that racism is a root. I know that many people look at racism as a root. I don't think that racism is a root. And I think that part of our inability to get to that place, one root of racism is fear. Another root of racism, is avarice, right? The type of pregnant greed that makes one desire to hold on to power. I do think that, a root of racism might be capitalism, which plays with the greed and fear to create, the types of hoarding that we see in society. Right, social ranking, based on race is like social ranking that was based on, family and class and more homogenous social settings. We've always had, in some ways, these castes, and at the root of these castes is the idea of a performance of humanity that wants to project itself above other features and forms of humanity. And I think it's important for us to get there. The other part is exposure. That our world's become so small. We read, the newspapers that think like us. We look at the news channel that, kind of echoes our thoughts. We, hang out with people who are not too far away from where we are. We live in a fairly insular world, right? That type of tribalism, especially when it comes to the level of, the ways that we think and the ways that we behave and be, how we see ourselves, the mirrors that we get to put up for ourselves, and the ways that we fear seeing these other parts of ourselves that may be less advantageous, right? That is another fabric. That is another root. Mm. And there's a question about, what it means to see some kids from a deficit perspective in order to see your kids not from that perspective. Right. Toni Morrison writes in Playing in the Dark that whiteness owes much to its construction of blackness, because without blackness, you have no whiteness. Without, something to stand on, you're at the same elevation as everyone else. And because of the human hunger and need to be, lofty, because of the human drive to be, to hold their head up to a place where other people cannot, right? We create these steps. We create these staircases or these stones that we stand on. And that becomes the fundamental architecture of what Niobe Way has called the crisis of connection, our ability to disconnect from others. And that ability to disconnect from others creates a crucible of racism that begins to drive and explain all of these other things. It's the reason why some parents can care about their kids and kind of objectify, other kids, not care about other kids. It's the reason why we hold on to and cling to narratives that some people are in some ways genetically or culturally or socially deficient. At the root of it is a fear, lack of exposure, the idea that we want to be better, a supremacy, or the idea of supremacy that these things are based on. Right? And when we begin to understand, what these ingredients are, we can begin to attack, the cause of the racist disease, right? Seeing racism as a symptom of something else, as opposed to just attacking racism as a symptom of something that's much deeper. And I know that this may not be, politically correct to say. And it's not to say that racism isn't a problem. Racism is fundamentally and very much a problem. But it may not be the root, right? It may not be the self-causing thing that we need to begin to, explore and look at when we're talking about having conversations with, curing not only people, but curing our society, from the ills of, social disablement and hatred and, this visceral feeling that others are inferior, that seem to be so, rampant. Inside of our society.
Yeah, that's really powerful, because I think if what we're actually talking about is the ways that we divide ourselves, the ways that we look to, hold our heads above other people, as you were saying, to find our ways to the top, that if we're not fighting back against that sort of underlying thing, then if we fix the racism, then we haven't actually fixed the problem.
That's right.
We just find some other way to try to hold ourselves up above other people.
Right. So those things get articulated in another way. And they already do get articulated in another way. Right? When you do have, homogenous populations, the kid, who grows up without a father, he has a mother, a single mother, well, that kid is a little bit less than. Or if, they live on the other side of their tracks in a trailer home and they go to the school, where you all live in a trailer home and we live in a bigger, if a person, happens to be a size that's not socially acceptable, within a particular space, or if they have a gender identity that does not correspond with what we would consider typical, right? I mean, these things articulate themselves in a variety of ways, but at the fundamental base, when we get to the root, it's going to require that we ask questions about how we socially organize ourselves. At the base, when we get to the root, it's going to raise questions about whether or not, capitalist competition, our hunger for, elevation, the idea that we're constantly in competition with our brothers and sisters, whether or not that's the way we want to continue to organize ourselves. And if not, we organize ourselves in a different way. This is what integration is fundamentally about. It's about asking that question about, can we fundamentally organize ourselves in a different way where our differences aren't seen as a problem, but where our differences are seen as places where we can not just celebrate, right, but let live and exist alongside each other, right? Let's be in a world where difference, forms the vibrancy and the essence, of our being. That piece is important. Integration will beg that we ask a different set of questions of ourselves and about, the world that we want to live in.
David, one of the things that comes into conversations around education kind of in general, and certainly the issue of segregation in particular, is this idea of pity, right? Like at those schools, right? Like we can feel badly for those students who aren't getting XYZ things or don't have access to XYZ opportunities, but pity itself is such a distancing position. And I think it's incredibly toxic.
There's an arrogance to pity. And that arrogance is, it's fundamentally revealing. Those who can pity is expressing a type of license. They're expressing a type of, racism, the racism that Michelle Alexander calls indifference, that you can distance a problem from yourself. It allows you to say that you are in some way superior, like white supremacy, and that someone else is inferior. Anti-Black, anti-brown racism. It feeds within these larger narratives that we've been talking about, right? And part of the arrogance of pity is the conclusions that it draws. These assumptions about, something being, fundamentally wrong with other individuals, but also the conclusion that suggests that something is fundamentally right about me. Like that one can hoard opportunity. That you go to school, like here in New York City, we have some students, who get to enjoy schooling where, they have Starbucks, they have escalators, they have, marble casings, on the stairwells and other places. Right? They enjoy these extremely luxurious, conditions. Whereas you have other students who go to school every day and they're met by metal detectors. They don't have windows in the school. And when they do, those windows are barred. The school functions much like a factory, mixed with a prison, right? And for individuals to pity the students that go to those schools without pitying the position of luxury and extravagance that they live in while other people don't have those conditions, it speaks to, a larger narrative of dehumanization that exists within those who would pity. It's like if I had a mansion with 100 rooms and I only live in one and 99 go unlived in every night. And I see someone homeless on a cold street and I pity them for not having a home. But the problem isn't there. The problem is mine. Where's my compassion? I have 100 rooms. I have more than enough. What happened to me? What happened to me? Fundamentally, what happened to me that I cannot, for another human being, embrace their humanity in ways that convicts me for having too much? And there is a such thing. I know our society doesn't want to suggest that you can have too much, but there is a such thing as having too much. And the problem with equity is, given the social, condition of the world, right? The problem with equity for so many people, especially those who have too much, the problem with equity is giving anything up feels like oppression. And for us to achieve equity, some people will have to give some things up so that other people can rightly gain. Even if those gains are about, having the basics. So some people will have to give some things up. And so to me, that pity stand, it is an illustration of another problem, a larger problem that ties into, the ways that we have been dehumanized. we have been dehumanized in this conversation toward not only indifference, but dehumanized in a way that props ourselves up. This belief that the things that we have are earned, the things that we have and possess belong to us, based on our own merits, right? The myth of meritocracy. And some of those things, some of those tangles need to be untangled. They need to be torn down as well.
There are these big issues around sort of societal level problems. What do you think the power is in the school, at the school level? If we're working towards integration at the school level, why should our energies be focused there rather than housing or workplace or other areas that we could focus that?
Well, let me just say, of course, those things are, interrelated. That neighborhood residential segregation does drive school segregation. And of course, our inability to integrate, the workforce, completely, where everyone has a job, where everyone gets paid, it drives some of the segregation and inequity that we see within schooling, right? And I think we would be naive to suggest that there is no interrelationship. But I do think that there's some things that schools can do alone. I do think that, school segregation isn't just de facto, right? A matter of, consequence, or a matter of chance. I do believe that, some of school segregation is de jure. It's a matter of policy or sets of policies that have been written over the long run. I gave you policies that dealt with, student placement. When we begin to think about student placement, some students, almost, curated by race, between gifted and talented programs, magnet schooling, and, special education programs and discipline programs, like who gets, kicked out, where, discipline becomes another type of, academic placement program. These are forms of segregation that are driven by policy. They're driven, exclusively by school policy. And when we begin to look at, the biggest casualty of Brown, the biggest casualty of Brown wasn't just that, people were forced to be with one another before they were ready, or the illusion of desegregation for integration, right? The biggest casualty of Brown were Black and brown teachers. Pre-Brown, we had a supple Black teaching force. After Brown, the Black teaching force begins to disappear. Well, we need to bring back that Black teaching force, because we understand that all students benefit from having a diverse teacher experience, right? And there is research that suggests that all students say that they kind of like having, teachers of color, right? So we do have these policy things that have created the situation of school segregation that we see. And what we need to do, we need to back up. We need to take a look at policies at local levels and see how they contribute to segregation. And then we need to begin to think about ways to incentivize schools and districts to integrate. And see integration, as something that is desirable within the metrics of schooling. Just like we see test scores as important. We should want to see, a diversity among teachers, a diversity in terms of curriculum material, a diversity in terms of how we spend resources, a diversity in terms of how we restore and discipline our young people, a diversity in terms of our enrollment practices of students. We should see that as a gold standard of education, and we should, reward schools who commit, to creating integration across those 5 domains. And to me, just as, there's so much of segregation has been constructed and maintained through, a web of policies, I do think that we can create incentives and policies that can begin to untangle or disentangle that web, and create for conditions that will inspire integration.
I agree. Are there any last things that you'd like to leave with our listeners, who are parents who are either have enrolled their kids in, global majority schools, because our listenership is largely white and or privileged, or who are thinking about kindergarten or middle school for next year? Are there any last things you'd like for them to kind of walk away thinking about?
A few things. I would say, read the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education. So read Brown 1, also read Brown 2. I would say read also both decisions in the Michigan Milliken decisions, Milliken 1 and 2, around forced busing and why desegregation is not integration, and how we need to move beyond desegregation to anti-segregation and integration. And those two things aren't, mutually exclusive. Read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. I think it's a phenomenal book. Read anything by Vanessa Sitter Walker, who deals with the history of segregation in the United States and its impact on our schools. Listen to podcasts and read things by Nicole Hannah-Jones. I think that Nicole Hannah-Jones is one of the thought leaders, on the conversation, national thought leaders on the conversation around integration and segregation in the United States. She deserves to be listened to. I would also say, take a look at Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mark Lamont Hill's Nobody, Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, as well as a slew of other books. Ta-Nehisi Coates' We Were 8 Years in Power, where he deals directly with the question of resources in terms of compensatory payback, what we know now as, reparations. But also read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. I think that these books give an amazing and excellent foundation, both in terms of a history, a deep history of how our country has segregated itself and how policies, programs, and decisions played a big role in that segregation. And I also think that, we need a context behind what a segregated society means for those who exist and live in concentrated vulnerability. The last thing I would say is begin to distinguish diversity, inclusion, and integration as a form of transformation, social transformation, are not the same. Diversity is like being asked to the dance. Inclusiveness or inclusion is like being asked to dance. But integration, from a racial justice perspective, as in transformation, is the ability to dance on your own terms, to your own song, in your own way, your own beat. And that's what we want. We don't just want to be invited. We don't just want to be asked to dance. We want to be able to dance to that song that most resonates with us, to the thing that makes our feet move in the ways that our feet move, and the ways that other people's feet move may be different than ours, and that is okay. We want that type of world. And so we're going to need to do some digging. We're going to need to begin to be clear about what we're talking about when we talk about integration. I think that integration is a worthwhile thing to aspire toward, because I think at the end of integration, we have a better world, not just for ourselves and others, but for our futures. And I think that's what we need to aspire to. So I want to thank your listeners too. So thank you all, and thank teachers.
So I feel like this is one I'm going to be coming back to a lot. It's a much different kind of conversation than the ones that we have that are like on the level of the potluck or nachos or something.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's space for both, right? I think they're both important, but I'm very grateful to Dr. Kirkland for giving us this sort of necessary meta view of integration, really a grounding and a vision for integration.
Yeah. And I think he provides like a really clear call to action that shies away from nothing,
Yeah.
So we always do a kind of summary at the end of these episodes. And Andrew, I don't want to. I just kind of want to let this lie, right?
Yeah, there's a lot. I think we need to listen to him for sure, and maybe not us.
Not us.
Yeah. But I will say, just because I can't resist it, I think the thing that I would like to just put out here now, because I think it's important, is the thing that's been sticking with me since this conversation with Dr. Kirkland is the importance of language, the importance of how we talk about things.
Yeah.
The opportunity barriers versus opportunity gaps. A barrier was constructed, a gap just exists. There's real power in highlighting the intentionality in how we talk about these things. He pushed back about my question about privilege and opportunity following white people to say that we constructed a system that allows for that. I'm not sure we were talking about different things, but the way we were talking about it was different, and that's important.
Yeah, I think this is something we can definitely be much more deliberate about.
Yeah.
And I think in this interview, there was some calling out, right, of our work as integrated schools and, some shining of light on the centering of white families in this work that we need to take seriously.
Yeah, and we will in an upcoming episode.
Not right now.
So, dear listeners, what do you think about it? Send us your voice memos, send us your emails, hello@integratedschools.org, and check your show notes for all the homework that Dr. Kirkland has given us.
Yeah.
I know I've got my work cut out for me.
Yeah, I'll be busy. And I think we just need to sit a while and ingest. So,
yeah.
Thanks to everyone who has emailed and rated and reviewed the podcast. Your feedback means a lot to us. And we are grateful to be in this with you all as we try to know better and do better.
See you next time.